My name is Emily. I'm 27 years old and I live in Wichita, Kansas. Photography has always been a hobby of mine, especially rural landscape photography. Whenever I have a free weekend, I like to get in my car, drive down back roads, and look for different places to photograph. This happened at the end of September last year. I had gone out alone around early afternoon with the intention of photographing sunflower fields that usually look beautiful that time of year. The weather was pleasant, dry, and the temperature was probably around 72 degrees Fahrenheit. I spent most of the day driving through rural areas, going in and out of small gravel roads. As the sun began to set, I found a narrow road surrounded by huge sunflower fields on both sides. It was exactly the kind of scenery I was looking for. There were no visible houses, no silos, and no tractors working nearby, just miles of crops and a few power lines stretching across the horizon. I pulled my Subaru onto the dirt shoulder, grabbed my camera and backpack, and started walking a few yards along the side of the road looking for the best angles. While taking pictures, I started noticing something strange in the field to my right. Some distance away, maybe 300 or 400 yards into the field, there was a white pickup truck parked there. The vehicle looked old, maybe a Ford from the early 2000s. What caught my attention was its location. There was no visible access road leading to it. There was no nearby farmhouse either. It was simply parked in the middle of the sunflowers. I remember using my camera's zoom lens to get a better look. The windows appeared dark and I couldn't see anyone inside. At the time, I assumed it was probably a farmer working on the property and didn't think much more about it. I continued taking photos for about 40 minutes as the sky became more and more orange. The wind was light and made the sunflowers produce that soft sound of leaves brushing against one another. The place was extremely quiet. I hadn't seen a single car pass since I arrived. As the light started fading, I decided to head back to my vehicle before it got completely dark. That's when I noticed the first thing that truly made me uncomfortable. When I reached my car, I immediately noticed that my backpack wasn't where I had left it. Before going out to take pictures, I had placed it on the front passenger seat because I planned to grab an extra lens later. Now it was on the back seat. My first reaction was to look for a logical explanation. I thought maybe I had moved it myself without paying attention. I had spent the entire day driving and photographing, so it wouldn't have been impossible to forget a detail like that. Still, it bothered me. I'm organized with my equipment and usually remember exactly where I leave everything. I opened the backpack to make sure everything was still there. My wallet, extra batteries, lenses, and keys were all in place. Nothing seemed to be missing. Even so, I started feeling that strange sensation that something wasn't right. The sun was already very low, and the golden light was giving way to darker shades. The wind had picked up a little and was making the sunflowers sway in waves. I clearly remember looking around the road and realizing how completely alone I was. No engine sounds, no visible houses, and no sign of another person nearby. I was zipping up the backpack when I heard a noise coming from the field beside me. It wasn't loud. It sounded like plants being pushed aside. I looked up instinctively and froze. Among the sunflowers, maybe 15 or 20 yards from the road, there was a head rising above the flowers. It was a man. At least it appeared to be. I could only see part of his face and shoulders because the sunflowers were tall. What frightened me wasn't simply seeing him there. It was realizing that he was completely still. He wasn't walking. He wasn't working. He wasn't waving. He was just watching me. I remember feeling an immediate cold sensation in my stomach. For a few seconds, I tried to convince myself he was probably a farmer checking the crops. But that didn't make sense. If he was a worker, why would he be hiding among the sunflowers watching a stranger? Then, an even worse thought hit me. I had no idea how long he had been there. While I had been focused on taking photographs, he could have spent several minutes, maybe even more than half an hour, watching my every move without me realizing it. My immediate reaction was to get into the car. I opened the driver's door without taking my eyes off him and quickly climbed inside. As soon as I shut the door, I locked everything by reflex. The man remained exactly where he was. The light was getting worse by the minute, and I still couldn't clearly make out his features. All I knew was that he was looking in my direction. I grabbed my phone to check for service. A weak signal bar kept appearing and disappearing. I thought about calling someone, but I didn't know exactly what I would say. "There's a man standing in a field watching me." Didn't sound like an emergency. While I was trying to decide what to do, something farther back caught my attention. The sunflowers began moving in another section of the field. Not near the man, farther away, as if something was moving through the rows. That made me hold my breath. I watched for a few seconds and saw the movement continue. At that moment, I realized the man I was looking at might not be alone. Maybe there was another person in there, or more than one, and that made the whole situation much harder to ignore. I started the engine immediately. The sound seemed absurdly loud in the silence. As soon as the headlights came on, the man lowered his head and disappeared into the sunflowers. He simply vanished. I expected to feel relieved, but the opposite happened. Now I couldn't see him anymore. I had no idea where he was. I put the car in gear and slowly started driving away. The road was narrow and full of potholes, so I couldn't accelerate much right away. That's when I saw something in my side mirror. A few yards behind where I had been parked, a person emerged from the field on the opposite side of the road. This time I got a better look. It was clearly an adult man wearing a dark baseball cap. He didn't run or make any gestures. He just stood there watching my car drive away. My heart was pounding. I kept driving and looked again in the rearview mirror. Then I saw a second man appear beside him. Both of them stood there watching the road. Neither of them seemed surprised that I was there. The impression I got was that they had known exactly where I was the entire time. After about a minute of driving, I started feeling a little safer. The men were falling behind and I could no longer see them in the mirror. Even so, something continued bothering me. Maybe it was the fact that I still didn't understand what was happening. I was fairly familiar with that area and knew that farmers often moved through the fields, but none of this felt normal. The abandoned pickup truck in the middle of the sunflowers, the hidden man watching me, the backpack being moved, and now two people emerging from the crops just as I was leaving. While thinking about all of that, I looked ahead and saw something that made my stomach sink again. About half a mile farther down the road, a dirt path came out of the field and connected to the road I was on, and a white pickup truck had just emerged from it. It was impossible to be completely certain at that distance, but it looked exactly like the same vehicle I had seen parked in the middle of the field. The truck pulled onto the road slowly and turned in the same direction I was traveling. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence. After all, it was a rural area. Pickup trucks were common. But the feeling that it was connected to the men became harder and harder to ignore. I kept driving without increasing my speed too much because I didn't want to show panic. I constantly checked the rearview mirror. During the first few moments, the pickup remained at a distance. Then it started closing the gap between us. Nothing aggressive, nothing that would justify calling the police, but enough to make me extremely uncomfortable. The road cut through miles of nearly empty farmland. There were no gas stations, stores, or nearby houses. Just fields growing darker beneath the fading evening light. The temperature seemed to have dropped considerably after sunset, but my hands were sweating on the steering wheel. A few minutes later, I reached an intersection and turned left without using GPS, just to test something. The pickup made the same turn. My chest tightened immediately. I continued for several more miles and turned onto another secondary road. Once again, it turned behind me. That was the moment I stopped looking for innocent explanations. Maybe they weren't following me. Maybe it was a coincidence. But I was no longer willing to find out which possibility was true. While remaining alone in the middle of nowhere, I grabbed my phone again and opened the map. The signal was still weak, but I managed to locate a small town about 15 minutes away. It wasn't exactly a town, really. It looked more like a cluster of a few streets with a gas station, a church, and only a handful of buildings. My plan became simple. Keep driving until I found other people. As I continued down the road, the pickup stayed behind me. Sometimes it fell farther back. Sometimes it got a little closer. What made its behavior so strange was the fact that it wasn't aggressive. If someone had been trying to scare me, they probably would have accelerated or ridden my bumper. Instead, the driver seemed interested only in making sure they didn't lose sight of me. That made me even more nervous. I couldn't stop thinking about the backpack. The more I reflected on it, the more certain I became that I hadn't moved it myself. I clearly remembered leaving it on the front seat. That meant someone had been standing next to my car while I was taking photographs. Maybe while I was looking at the pickup in the field. Maybe while I believed I was completely alone. The idea that someone had been moving around so close to me without being noticed was what truly terrified me. When I finally started seeing the first lights of the small town, I felt an enormous sense of relief. There was a brightly lit gas station near the main intersection. I pulled into the parking lot without hesitation. The place wasn't crowded, but there were a few pickup trucks parked there, an employee inside the store, and 2 people pumping gas. As soon as I stopped, I immediately checked the mirror. The white pickup drove past the entrance to the gas station at a reduced speed. For a few seconds, I thought it was going to pull in behind me. Instead, it continued down the main street and disappeared into the darkness. I sat inside my car for almost 5 minutes with the doors locked before working up the courage to get out. I went into the store, bought a bottle of water that I never even drank, and stayed there watching through the windows. Part of me expected the pickup to return at any moment. It never did. Even so, I stayed at the gas station for more than an hour before continuing my trip. I needed to be sure nobody was waiting for me outside. By that point, the fear wasn't coming only from what had happened, but from how many things had probably happened around me that I never saw. I ended up driving straight home that night. The trip would normally have taken a little over an hour, but it felt much longer. The entire drive, I kept checking my mirrors constantly. Every pair of headlights that appeared behind me made my heart race. When I finally pulled into my garage in Wichita, it was fully dark outside. I went inside, locked the door, and only then started unloading my equipment. That's when I found something that made me uncomfortable in a different way. Inside one of the backpack's outer compartments was a small, cut sunflower bloom. Not an entire sunflower, just the flower itself. I never would have placed it there. In fact, I'm very careful not to collect plants from private property when I'm photographing. I stared at it for several minutes, trying to find a reasonable explanation. Maybe it had gotten caught on the backpack while I was walking. Maybe someone had put it there as a joke. Maybe there was a completely innocent explanation for everything. But the more I thought about the sequence of events, the less convinced I became of those possibilities. The flower went into the trash that same night, but the feeling of being violated stayed with me for a long time afterward. This happened about a year ago, and I still think about it from time to time. I never found out who those men were or why they were hiding inside the field watching a stranger. I also never found out why the pickup truck was parked so far from any visible road. Some people I've told this story to have suggested they may have been hunters, farm workers, or simply locals who were suspicious of someone taking photographs in the area. Maybe they're right. Honestly, I hope that's all it was. The problem is that none of those explanations account for someone apparently going through my belongings while I was distracted. Nor do they explain why 2 people stood silently watching without saying a single word. Or why the pickup appeared at the exact moment I left and mirrored every turn I made for miles. I still enjoy photographing rural areas, but since that day, I don't return to isolated places alone. And every time I see tall fields on both sides of an empty road, I remember the feeling of looking up and finding someone standing among the plants, watching my every movement without me having the slightest idea how long they had been there. Story 2. My name is Ryan. I'm 38 years old and work as a real estate agent in southern Wyoming. In addition to selling properties, I sometimes perform preliminary property evaluations for families who have inherited land or homes and don't fully know what they own. This happened in early October of 2023. A family living in Denver had inherited an old property that belonged to a distant uncle who had passed away a few years earlier. The house was located in an extremely isolated area of Wyoming, more than an hour from the nearest town. They wanted an initial evaluation before deciding whether to sell everything or keep the land. Since I had been working in that region for years, I accepted the job. I left early that morning and spent most of the day driving along rural roads, checking fences, property boundaries, and access points. The place was even more isolated than I had imagined. There were long stretches without any sign of habitation. Just dry hills, old fences, and empty fields stretching as far as the eye could see. The weather was cold, typical for that time of year, and a steady wind blew across the open areas. It was already late afternoon when I finished inspecting one section of the property and started following a dirt road that led to the main house. I had been told that the residence had been abandoned for several years. According to the family, nobody had lived there since the owner's death. As the sun disappeared behind the hills, I began to see the house in the distance. It sat on top of a gentle rise, surrounded by a few old trees and a heavily deteriorated wooden fence. The first thing that caught my attention was the lighting. Every window appeared illuminated. Not just one or two lights. All of them. The entire house was glowing in the darkness that was beginning to settle over the area. I remember immediately slowing down. The information I had received was that the power supply should have been disconnected for years. For a few seconds, I thought I might have been given the wrong address, but I checked the GPS and the paperwork. It was the correct property. I continued moving forward slowly while watching the house. The closer I got, the stranger it seemed. There were no vehicles parked outside, no visible movement, no sign of people entering or leaving. Just that old house, isolated on top of the hill with every light on as if someone were expecting visitors. When I got closer, I parked my truck beside the main fence and remained seated for a few moments watching. The engine was still running, and the headlights illuminated part of the property's entrance. I tried to find a simple explanation for what I was seeing. Maybe a neighbor was taking care of the place. Maybe the family had forgotten to mention that someone occasionally maintained it. Even so, something felt wrong. The property gave off a strange sense of abandonment. The paint was peeling, some of the porch boards looked warped, and weeds had grown heavily around the structure. It didn't match a regularly occupied residence. I grabbed my flashlight, the evaluation documents, and started walking toward the entrance. The wind was stronger on that part of the hill and produced a constant whistling sound as it passed through the dry trees near the house. As I approached the porch, I noticed that the front door wasn't closed. It remained slightly open, swaying a few inches back and forth whenever the wind blew harder. That immediately put me on alert. Empty houses are usually locked or at least closed. Seeing the door standing open in such an isolated area didn't seem normal. I climbed the steps slowly and called out for anyone inside before entering. Several times I announced that I was there to evaluate the property and didn't want to disturb anyone. I received no response. The only sounds were the wind outside and the occasional creak of the door moving on its old hinges. When I pushed the door fully open, I noticed something that made me even more uncomfortable. The house didn't look abandoned for years. There was dust on some furniture, but not on others. On a table near the kitchen sat a relatively clean mug. On a counter, I saw a modern flashlight and an empty package of crackers. Under different circumstances, I would have assumed someone was temporarily living there. The problem was that the family insisted nobody had visited the property in a very long time. I continued walking through the ground floor, observing the rooms. Some of the light bulbs flickered slightly, casting uneven shadows across the walls. The smell inside the house was strange as well. It wasn't the strong odor of an abandoned building. There was a faint scent of old wood mixed with recent smoke, as if someone had used a fireplace or heater only a few hours earlier. That was the moment I seriously began considering the possibility that someone was occupying the house without permission. I took out my phone and tried calling the family's contact number, but the signal was practically non-existent in that area. I could only watch the screen switch between one bar and none. I put the phone back in my pocket and continued the inspection. I didn't want to stay any longer than necessary, but I still needed to verify the property's basic condition. I passed through the kitchen, the main living room, and a small office near the staircase. In every room, I found little details that made me increasingly uneasy. There were recent footprints in the dust along some hallways. Not many, but they were visible. I also found a partially full bottle of water on a countertop. The contents still appeared fresh. Everything suggested that someone had been there recently or perhaps was still there at that very moment. While examining the office, I heard a distant noise coming from the upper floor. It was brief. A wooden pop, like the sounds old houses naturally make. I stopped to listen more carefully. The silence immediately returned. I tried convincing myself it was simply the structure reacting to the nighttime temperature. Even so, I felt that growing tension that appears when your brain begins realizing something isn't right, before you fully understand what it is. A short time later, I walked to the foot of the staircase and shined my flashlight toward the second floor. At that exact moment, Every light in the house went out at the same time. There was no flickering, no gradual failure. 1 second the house was illuminated. The next it was plunged into complete darkness. The contrast was so sudden that I needed a few moments to orient myself using only the flashlight. My heart immediately started racing. My first thought was a power outage, but before I could process it, I heard something running on the upper floor. It wasn't a subtle sound. It was the sound of fast, heavy footsteps crossing the hallway above me. The floorboards creaked repeatedly under the weight of someone moving quickly. The sound started from one end of the house and came directly toward the staircase. I froze. Every step sounded closer. The flashlight trembled in my hand. Then I heard the unmistakable creak of the first stair above me. Whoever was upstairs had reached the staircase and seemed to be starting their descent. My first reaction was to immediately back away toward the hallway leading to the front door. I had absolutely no intention of finding out who was on that floor. Up until that point, I had still been trying to rationalize everything, thinking about squatters, trespassers, or someone using the property without authorization. But hearing those footsteps running directly toward the staircase completely changed the way I viewed the situation. The person wasn't trying to avoid contact. They were moving toward me. I kept the flashlight pointed at the top of the stairs while backing away. The beam illuminated only part of the staircase and handrail. I expected someone to appear at any second. The sound continued for a few more moments and then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even worse. I could hear only my own breathing and the wind outside the house. I remained still for several seconds, trying to identify any other noise. That's when I heard a faint scratching sound coming from the upstairs hallway, as if someone had changed direction after reaching the staircase. That meant the person was still up there and probably knew exactly where I was. Without taking my eyes off the staircase, I began backing toward the exit. When I reached the main living room, something caught my attention through one of the side windows. I saw a light moving outside the house. It looked like a flashlight. For a second, I felt relieved, imagining it might be a utility worker or someone connected to the property. But I quickly realized that was impossible. The light was moving behind the house, among the trees, without any vehicle nearby. On top of that, it disappeared and reappeared irregularly, as if the person carrying it was trying to avoid being seen through the windows. My discomfort increased instantly. Now I wasn't worried only about someone upstairs. It seemed there was another person moving around outside. I continued backing away until I reached the front door. When I finally stepped onto the porch, the cold air hit my face and I felt brief relief at being outside the house. But that relief lasted only a few seconds. When I looked toward my truck parked near the fence, I noticed that the passenger door was open. I was absolutely certain I had locked it before entering. At that moment, I stopped thinking about property evaluations, paperwork, or anything else related to work. My only goal became getting out of there. I ran down the porch steps and headed toward the truck without taking my eyes off the house. I expected to see someone appear in the doorway or at one of the windows at any moment. The wind continued blowing hard across the hill, causing the tree branches to move erratically around the property. When I reached the vehicle, I quickly checked the interior. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. The documents were still on the seat and my backpack remained in the same place. Even so, the door had definitely been open. I climbed inside, started the engine, and locked everything immediately. As I maneuvered to leave, my headlights illuminated part of the front of the house. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. There was a figure standing in one of the second-floor windows. I couldn't make out a face, age, or any specific details. I only knew that someone was standing there watching. The person didn't move, didn't wave, didn't try to hide. They simply remained motionless while I backed up and pointed the truck toward the road leading out. The sight lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough to convince me that I was definitely not alone on that property. I drove without stopping until I reached an area where I finally got cell service. I pulled onto the shoulder and called the county sheriff's office. I explained the entire situation, including the illuminated house, the signs of occupancy, and the noises I had heard inside the residence. A deputy called me back sometime later. According to him, a team had been sent to check the property that same night. What unsettled me was the response I received. They found the property empty. No vehicles, no people, no generator running, no lights on. The house was completely dark when they arrived. The deputy commented that there were signs someone may indeed have been there recently, but nothing that could identify who it was or how long they had been using the place. I never received any additional information beyond that. Months later, the family ended up selling the property to a local buyer. To this day, I don't know who was in that house that night, or why there seemed to be people both inside and around it. What bothers me most isn't the footsteps on the upper floor, or the lights going out all at once. It's remembering that someone opened the door to my truck while I was trapped inside that house, unaware that I was probably being watched the entire time. Since then, whenever I have to visit isolated properties, I make sure never to go inside alone. Story 3. My name is Travis. I'm 34 years old and I've worked in telecommunications systems maintenance in Nevada for more than 10 years. A large part of my job involves driving alone to extremely remote locations, usually communication towers installed on mountains, in deserts, or on properties far away from any town. I was already used to that kind of routine. I would spend hours without seeing another person, often without cell service and relying solely on the company's radio for any emergency. What happened to me took place in late spring of 2022. At the time, I worked for a contractor that performed preventive maintenance on towers throughout the state. That morning, I received a work order to inspect a repeater station located in a desert area west of Ely. The place was so remote that the last 40 minutes of the trip were along a narrow dirt road surrounded only by rocks, dry brush, and low hills. The heat was intense during the day, but the air was still relatively pleasant when I arrived near mid-morning. I was alone, driving a white company pickup truck loaded with tools, batteries, and testing equipment. The property was simple. There was a chain-link fence around the tower, a small equipment shelter, and an access gate connected to the only road leading out of the area. After parking, I started the job normally. I spent several hours checking cables, connections, and power systems. Everything seemed routine. The location was so quiet that I could hear the wind passing through the tower cables whenever the gusts became stronger. Around early afternoon, the sun was already intense and the temperature had risen considerably. I was working near the equipment shelter when I heard a burst of static coming from the portable radio attached to my belt. That wasn't unusual. Interference happened from time to time in remote areas. What was strange was that the static quickly gave way to voices. 2 people were talking. At first, I assumed it was just another crew using a nearby frequency. I continued working without paying much attention. But then I heard one of the voices mention a white pickup truck parked next to a tower. That immediately caught my attention because it described my vehicle and the location exactly. I stopped what I was doing and turned up the volume on the radio. The voices were faint but clear enough to understand. They were 2 men. Judging by the tone of the conversation, they seemed to be speaking normally as if they had no idea that anyone else was listening. One of them mentioned that the pickup was parked near the equipment shelter. He then commented that the technician was still working on the northern side of the property. I stood frozen for a few seconds trying to process what I had just heard. I instinctively looked around, but I didn't see anyone. The area around the tower was completely open. There were no trees, buildings, or nearby places where someone could easily hide. My first conclusion was that a coworker was pulling a prank using information from the work order. It wasn't impossible. Some employees had access to team schedules and knew which vehicles each technician used. I kept listening. Then one of the men commented that I would probably finish the job around 5 in the afternoon. That bothered me even more because it was exactly the time I had planned to leave the property. I had never transmitted that information over the radio or told anyone except the supervisor who assigned me the task. For several minutes, I remained focused on finding a logical explanation. The conversation continued appearing between periods of static. At one point, one of the men described the access road and mentioned that it was the only way out of the area. That was when I started feeling genuinely uncomfortable. It no longer sounded like a random joke. Even so, I tried convincing myself that someone was simply using information obtained through some company monitoring system. Maybe they were watching cameras. Maybe there was some technical misunderstanding involving repeater frequencies. I decided to ignore the radio and finish the job as quickly as possible. About 20 minutes later, I climbed a small rise inside the property to inspect a set of secondary antennas. From there, I could see much of the access road crossing the desert. That's when I saw something that immediately made my stomach drop. About half a mile from the gate, two vehicles were parked sideways across the road. One was facing one direction, the other was facing the opposite direction. Even from that distance, it was obvious that they occupied almost the entire width of the exit route. I watched for several seconds, trying to understand what I was seeing. The road was occasionally used by ranchers, maintenance crews, and a few hunters, but it was extremely unusual to find two vehicles stopped at exactly that spot. What caught my attention most was that they didn't appear to be parked normally. They were positioned strangely, almost as if someone had deliberately stopped them to block part of the passage. I grabbed a small pair of binoculars I kept in the truck and tried to get a better look. One of the vehicles appeared to be a dark pickup. The other was a light-colored SUV. The windows were closed and I couldn't identify anyone around them. For a few seconds, I considered simply continuing my work and waiting for them to leave. But at that exact moment, the radio emitted another burst of static. Then I heard one of the voices again. The man said something like, he's already seen the vehicles. The sentence was short and immediately followed by more interference. A chill ran through my body. For the first time that day, I seriously considered that the conversation wasn't a coincidence and that it might be directly connected to the vehicles on the road. I climbed down from the rise and quickly walked back to the truck. My heart was racing, although I still tried to keep my head clear. I got into the vehicle, started the engine, and spent a few moments evaluating the situation. Part of me wanted to drive directly to the exit and find out what was going on. Another part told me to stay where I was, behind the property's fence, until I could contact someone. I picked up my phone, but as expected, there was no signal. I tried using the company radio to call the operations center. I received nothing but static. I made several attempts without success. The wind was growing stronger and was kicking up small clouds of dust around the property. While watching the road through the windshield, I noticed movement near the vehicles. Two figures appeared beside the dark pickup. The distance was too great to identify any details, but it looked like they were staring directly at the tower. They remained motionless for a few seconds. Then one of them pointed toward the property. I couldn't hear anything, obviously, but that simple gesture was enough to deepen my feeling that I had been under observation long before I realized anyone was there. At that point, I decided I wasn't going to wait around to find out what those people's intentions were. The property had a secondary service road used only for occasional tower maintenance. It didn't appear on most maps and ran for several miles through the desert before connecting to a state highway. It was a rough route, full of rocks and erosion, but in theory it would allow me to leave without passing the vehicles. While I hurriedly loaded my tools into the back of the truck, the radio transmitted again. This time the voices were clearer than at any other point during the day. One of the men said that I still hadn't left through the main gate. The other replied with something that made me freeze for a moment. He mentioned the service road. He didn't say its name, but he described exactly the alternative route I was about to use. At that moment, I completely stopped trying to find technical explanations for what was happening. Those men knew too much. They knew what vehicle I drove, where I was working, my approximate departure time, and now they even seemed to know about a secondary access route that very few people used. I closed the tailgate, got into the truck, and decided to leave immediately. I started driving down the alternate road without wasting any time. The first few minutes were slow because of the terrain conditions. The truck bounced constantly, and rocks repeatedly struck the underside of the vehicle. I checked the mirrors every few seconds. At first, I saw nothing behind me except dust. Then, about 10 minutes later, I noticed a cloud of dust appearing on the distant horizon. I couldn't identify the vehicle immediately, but something was coming from the same direction as the tower. I kept driving. The road wound gently through low hills and rocky terrain. As the vehicle got closer, I began to make out its shape. It was a dark pickup truck. I couldn't say for certain that it was the same one blocking the main exit, but it looked very similar. My heart was pounding at that point. I had no idea who those people were or what they wanted. The only thing I knew was that they kept appearing in the same places that had been mentioned during those radio transmissions. I maintained as much speed as the terrain allowed and continued heading toward the highway, hoping to reach an area with cell service before the distance between us closed any further. After several more miles, I finally reached higher ground, where my phone managed to pick up a signal. Without slowing down much, I called the county sheriff's office and explained the situation as objectively as possible. I knew part of the story sounded absurd, especially the radio portion, so I focused on the verifiable facts. I said that unknown individuals were watching an isolated property, that vehicles had blocked the main road, and that a pickup truck appeared to be following me along a secondary route. The dispatcher took the situation seriously and informed me that a deputy would be sent to the highway I was heading toward. I continued driving until I finally reached the pavement. When I arrived at the state highway, I pulled onto a small shoulder and looked back. The dirt road was empty. There was no pickup truck, no dust, no one. I remained there for several minutes waiting for law enforcement to arrive. When the patrol vehicle appeared, I told the story again and accompanied the deputies to a gas station in the nearest town. I never saw the vehicles from the main road again. Not that night, and not in the days that followed. A few weeks later, I spoke again with my supervisor and with technicians who had worked at that same tower before. None of them could explain what had happened. The only interesting piece of information I heard was that other employees had reported strange radio interference in that area over the years. Nothing like what I experienced, but transmissions appearing on the wrong frequencies and conversations emerging from unidentified sources. That obviously doesn't explain how those voices seemed to know exactly where I was or what I intended to do. It also doesn't explain the two vehicles blocking the property's only exit or the pickup truck appearing on the alternate route. Maybe it was all a coincidence. Maybe someone was using radio equipment to monitor workers in remote locations. Maybe there was a perfectly rational explanation that I simply never discovered. But to this day, there's one part of the story that still bothers me. During the call with the sheriff's office, I provided my approximate location. Hours later, when I reviewed the automatic recordings stored on the company's radio equipment, I found one of the final transmissions captured that day. Through the static, one of the voices calmly said, "Now he's heading to the highway." The recording was logged nearly 2 minutes before I managed to get a cell signal, and before any information about my location had been transmitted to anyone. Story 4. My name is Nathan. I'm 41 years old and live in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Hiking and camping have always been one of my main ways of escaping routine. Unlike many people who start this hobby without experience, I had already been hiking for nearly 15 years when this happened. I was used to spending nights alone in remote areas and generally felt comfortable being far away from other people. In early spring of 2023, I decided to take advantage of a few days off to explore an isolated region in the southern part of the state. It was a dry valley surrounded by low rock formations, known mainly among local backpackers. Outside of peak season, almost nobody went there. That was exactly what I was looking for. I wanted to spend a quiet night, photograph the sunrise, and return home the following morning. I left early, hiked for most of the day carrying my gear, and arrived at the valley late in the afternoon. The place was exactly as I remembered from the maps and reports I had researched. An open landscape covered with packed sand, scattered shrubs, and a few rocky areas. There were no rivers, roads, or structures nearby. I spent some time looking for a suitable place to pitch my tent. As I always do when camping alone, I walked a reasonable distance around the chosen area to check whether anyone else was nearby. I found no one. No tents, no extinguished campfires, no vehicles in the distance. Just silence. I set up camp shortly before sunset and prepared a simple meal using a small portable stove. As the temperature dropped, the valley became quieter and quieter. The wind practically disappeared after dark. It was one of those places where you can hear sounds from very far away, because there is almost nothing to interrupt the silence. Before getting into my tent, I used my flashlight to inspect the surroundings once again. The area remained completely empty. Thanks to the moonlight, I could see dozens of yards in every direction, and there was no sign of another campsite. Around 10 o'clock that night, I settled into my sleeping bag. I was tired from the hike and fell asleep relatively quickly, believing I was about to experience one of the most peaceful nights I had ever had on a trail. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up. My watch was inside my backpack and I didn't want to turn on any lights immediately. What woke me was a very specific sound. Anyone who has camped extensively knows the distinctive noise made by a tent zipper being opened slowly. It wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. During the first few seconds, still half asleep, I thought I might have been dreaming or confusing it with some environmental sound. I stayed still, trying to listen more carefully. The silence returned for a few moments. Then I heard it again. This time I was absolutely certain of what it was. It seemed to be coming from somewhere near my campsite. My heart immediately began to race. The first thing I thought was that another person had arrived in the valley after I fell asleep. That would have been strange, but not impossible. Some trails in the area could be traveled even at night. I remained lying down for a few more seconds, expecting to hear voices, footsteps, or some other sound confirming the presence of another camper. I heard nothing. The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear only my own breathing inside the tent. I grabbed my flashlight and carefully unzipped the entrance to my tent. The cold early morning air rushed in immediately. The temperature had dropped considerably, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the beam of light. I pointed the flashlight toward the surrounding area and needed a few seconds to understand what I was seeing. There was a tent about 20 yards away from mine. It was positioned on a small flat area between two low shrubs. I stared at it in disbelief. I am absolutely certain the tent was not there when I went to sleep. I had walked around the area before setting up camp. I had also checked the surroundings shortly before getting into my tent. The place had been empty. Yet now there was a dark tent sitting there. It appeared small, perhaps intended for a single person. No light came from inside. No equipment was visible outside. No vehicle could be seen nearby. Just that silent tent that had somehow appeared in the middle of the night. I continued watching it for several minutes, expecting someone to come out or some movement to occur. Nothing happened. The tent remained motionless in the darkness as if it had been there for days. The situation was strange enough that I considered walking over immediately to ask whether everything was okay. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the hour. Maybe it was the fact that I hadn't heard footsteps, voices, or any sound other than that zipper. If someone had arrived after I fell asleep, they would have needed to walk through the valley carrying equipment, pitch a tent, and organize their gear. I should have heard something. The absolute silence was what bothered me most. I remained seated at the entrance of my tent for several minutes, watching the spot. The moon illuminated part of the valley and allowed me to make out the shape of the tent without relying entirely on my flashlight. At one point, I even wondered whether it had already been there and I had simply failed to notice it. But I dismissed that idea almost immediately. I had examined the area several times. Besides, the reason I had chosen that campsite in the first place was because it was isolated from everyone else. I kept watching. No light appeared. No shadow moved. No sound came from that direction. It was as if the tent were empty. After nearly half an hour awake, I finally went back inside my tent. I closed the zipper but couldn't sleep. I lay there listening to the environment. Every few minutes, I peeked through the small opening at the entrance to see whether anything had changed. Nothing did. The valley remained silent. At some point, I must have briefly drifted off because the next thing I remember was noticing that the sky was beginning to brighten. It wasn't full daylight yet, but there was enough light to see the surroundings without a flashlight. I climbed out of my sleeping bag and opened the tent. The first thing I did was look toward the spot where the other tent stood. It was still there, in exactly the same position. I watched for a few moments, expecting to see some sign of activity now that dawn was approaching. Nothing, no movement, no sound. That's when I noticed something on the sandy ground between the two campsites. There were footprints. A very clear line of recent footprints crossed the valley toward my tent. The trail began near the entrance of the unknown tent and led directly to the place where I had spent the night. I immediately stood up and followed the footprints with my eyes. The ground in that region was perfect for preserving fresh tracks because the sand was fine and compact. There was no doubt that someone had walked there during the night. The footprints were deep and relatively clear. They appeared to have been made by a single person wearing hiking boots. What caught my attention was where they ended. The trail led directly to the side of my tent. Some of the prints came within less than 3 feet of the entrance where I was standing at that very moment. I stared at them, trying to understand. Then I noticed something even worse. There were no footprints leading back. I examined the ground several times to make sure I wasn't overlooking anything. The trail started near the unknown tent, crossed the valley, and ended beside my campsite. It simply ended. There was no second trail leading back to the other tent. There were no tracks heading toward the rocks. There were no footprints circling the campsite. It was as if someone had walked to my tent during the night and then disappeared. I knew there had to be a logical explanation, but at that moment I couldn't find one. Despite my growing discomfort, I decided to approach the other tent. I needed to find out who was there. Out of habit, I grabbed my flashlight, even though there was already enough daylight to see clearly, and slowly walked in the direction of the footprints. The closer I got, the stranger the situation seemed. There was no backpack outside, no boots left at the entrance, no water bottles, stove, or any equipment normally associated with a campsite. I stopped a few yards away and called out to whoever might be inside. No response. I called again, this time louder. The silence continued. My heart was pounding as I approached the entrance. The tent appeared perfectly set up, but something about it felt wrong. The fabric was too clean for someone who had supposedly hiked miles through the valley carrying equipment. On top of that, there was no sign of condensation, something common in occupied tents after a cold night. After hesitating for several seconds, I reached for the zipper and slowly opened it. The interior was completely empty. There was no sleeping bag, no backpack, no clothing. There was absolutely nothing inside, just the floor of the tent and the fabric walls. It was as if someone had pitched it in the middle of the night and left immediately afterward. I stood there staring into the empty interior for several seconds. The longer I looked, the less sense any of it made. If someone had decided to leave before sunrise, they would have left footprints in some direction. If they had packed up equipment, there would have been signs on the ground. If they had spent the night in the tent, I would have expected to find at least some forgotten item, but there was nothing. I left the tent and began walking around the area, searching for any other trace. I examined the ground for several minutes, found only the same footprints I had already seen. They left the tent and ended beside mine. Nothing else, no second trail, no tire tracks, no sign of another camper. The feeling was deeply unsettling because I'm used to resolving strange situations by finding a practical explanation. In this case, the more I searched, the fewer answers I found. I eventually returned to my campsite and immediately began packing my gear. I no longer had any interest in staying there to photograph the sunrise or explore the valley. I just wanted to leave that place while there was still enough daylight to hike safely. Before leaving, I looked one last time at the tent. It remained exactly where it had been. I considered reporting what had happened to the area rangers when I returned to the nearest town. And that's exactly what I did a few hours later. The response I received wasn't very helpful. They said there was no record of any other authorized campers in that area that night. They also mentioned that the region was rarely visited at that time of year. I returned to the valley a few months later accompanied by 2 friends because I wanted to determine whether I had somehow misinterpreted something. The place looked virtually identical, but I never found any explanation for what happened. To this day, the detail that bothers me most isn't the tent appearing during the night. It isn't even the footprints ending beside my tent. It's remembering the sound that woke me up, that zipper being opened. Because looking at the tracks in the ground the next morning, the only obvious conclusion was that someone left that tent during the night, walked to mine while I slept, and got close enough to touch the fabric of the entrance. The problem is that when the sun came up, there was nobody there to explain why. Story 5. My name is Melissa. I'm 32 years old and work as a nurse at a regional hospital in northern Arkansas. This happened during the Thanksgiving holiday weekend in 2021. I had taken advantage of my days off to visit some relatives who lived in a rural area near Mountain View. Since my job is usually very demanding, I rarely get to spend much time with family, so I decided to stay later than planned before heading home. I left shortly after 8 o'clock that evening. The plan was simple: drive about an hour and a half back to my town, take a shower, and rest before returning to work the next day. I knew most of the route because I had driven it many times over the years. Even so, some of the secondary roads in that region can be confusing at night, especially since many of them have no lighting at all. The weather was cold, but dry. There was no rain and no fog. The only illumination came from my headlights and the moon, which occasionally appeared between the clouds. Traffic was practically non-existent. For several miles, I didn't see another vehicle. About 40 minutes after starting the trip, I noticed that the GPS had recalculated the route. I didn't think much of it at first. Some areas in that region have poor signal, and the app tends to adjust constantly. The problem was that, distracted by music and thinking about the work week ahead, I ended up making a wrong turn without realizing it. The paved road gave way to a narrow dirt road lined with trees on both sides. At first, I assumed it was just a temporary shortcut suggested by the GPS. I continued driving for a few minutes, expecting to reconnect with the main road. That never happened. The road became more and more isolated. The tree branches formed a dark tunnel over the path and almost completely blocked the moonlight. The only thing I could see was the strip of ground illuminated by my headlights. That's when I started feeling that something was wrong. I looked at the GPS again and realized the signal had disappeared completely. The screen displayed only an incomplete map and could no longer determine my exact location. At that point, it was already too late to know where I had gone off route. I continued driving slowly while searching for a suitable place to turn around. The road was too narrow in many sections, and there were deep ditches on both sides. I didn't want to risk getting stuck or damaging the car. A few minutes later, I noticed that the terrain began sloping gently downward into a more open area. The trees became less dense, and I could see a little farther ahead with my headlights. That's when I saw something in front of me. There was a car parked at the end of the road. At first, I felt relieved, thinking there might be a house or some private property nearby. But as I got closer, I realized there was no visible house. The vehicle was simply parked partially across the road. It was a dark-colored sedan, relatively old. All of its lights were off. The engine appeared to be off. There was no one outside. I slowed almost to a complete stop. The scene immediately felt strange. If someone had mechanical trouble, they would normally leave their hazard lights on. Besides, it was an extremely isolated area. It didn't make sense for a car to be parked there without any sign of activity nearby. I kept my distance while trying to decide what to do. I considered honking, but something told me not to draw unnecessary attention to myself. The road ended just a few yards ahead in an area blocked by vegetation and an old fence, so continuing forward wasn't an option. I would have to go back the way I came. I shifted into reverse and began a slow turning maneuver. That's when something appeared on the left side of the road. At first I thought it was a reflection. Then I realized it was a light. It looked like a flashlight. It was standing motionless among the trees, several yards away from the road. Before I could understand what I was seeing, a second light appeared on the other side. Then a third. My heart immediately started racing. The flashlights didn't move. They remained stationary in the darkness, positioned on both sides of the road. I remember watching for several seconds, trying to convince myself that maybe they were people searching for something in the woods. But then I realized that all of them were pointed toward the road, more specifically toward my car. And what happened next was the moment when fear truly took hold of me. The lights began to move. Not quickly, not running, just slowly advancing toward me at the same time. The feeling I had in that moment was impossible to ignore. It didn't seem like those people were simply walking through the woods and had accidentally come across me. The flashlights were moving in a coordinated way. 2 were approaching from the left side of the road, and at least 2 were coming from the right. I couldn't see the bodies behind the lights, only the white beams moving through the trees. My heart was pounding so hard that I could feel the pulse in my hands as I gripped the steering wheel. I immediately stopped backing up and shifted into drive again. I thought about accelerating toward the parked sedan, but the position of the vehicle blocked most of the road. There wasn't enough room to get around it without risking driving off the road. For several seconds, I was trapped between 2 options. Drive toward the sedan blocking the road or continue trying to reverse while those lights drew closer. That's when I noticed something even worse. The driver's door of the sedan was open. I was absolutely certain it had been closed when I first saw the vehicle just moments earlier. The flashlights continued approaching. The distance between us was visibly shrinking. Some of them were now close enough to illuminate parts of the bushes along the road. I still couldn't make out faces or clothing, only dark silhouettes moving behind the beams of light. My instincts finally took over. I shifted into reverse and pressed the accelerator much harder than I normally would. The car began backing quickly down the narrow road. I could barely see where I was going because I was relying only on the mirrors and the rear camera. The tires kicked up dust and small rocks as I tried to create distance. I kept looking back and forth between the road ahead and behind me. The flashlights grew smaller as I retreated, but they didn't disappear. At one point, I saw 2 of them emerge from the woods and step directly onto the road. They weren't running, but they were clearly still advancing. That image remains burned into my memory, because it was the first time I realized without any doubt that several people were involved, and none of them seemed interested in asking for help or talking. They simply kept moving toward me in complete silence. I reversed as far as I could until I found a slightly wider section of road. There, I finally managed to turn the car around without risking sliding into a ditch. As soon as I straightened the vehicle, I accelerated in the opposite direction. The engine was working at its limit as I drove over the rough dirt sections. The road shook the entire car and I could barely keep a straight line in some places. Even so, I didn't slow down. I just wanted to put as much distance as possible between myself and those people. During the first few minutes, I constantly checked the rearview mirror, expecting to see flashlights or headlights appear behind me. I saw nothing. That should have reassured me, but it had the opposite effect. I had no idea what those people were doing there, or why that car was blocking the road. The more I thought about the situation, the more it felt like I had interrupted something I wasn't supposed to see. I continued driving for several miles until I finally rejoined the paved road I had accidentally left earlier. Only then did I begin to feel some relief. The problem was that the night was far from over. A few minutes after returning to the pavement, my phone finally regained signal. I pulled onto the shoulder and called the county sheriff's office. I explained everything that had happened, including the approximate location of the dirt road. The dispatcher listened carefully and took down the information. Because I was alone, nervous, and unable to pinpoint my exact location on a map, I had difficulty identifying the correct road. Even so, a team was sent to investigate the area. The next day, I received a follow-up call from a deputy. According to him, officers found the road I had described. The sedan was no longer there. They also found no people in the area. The detail that unsettled me was another piece of information he mentioned. Near the end of the road, there were fresh signs of multiple vehicles entering and leaving the area during the night. When I asked who those people were or what they had been doing there, he said they had been unable to determine that. To this day, I still don't know what really happened on that road. But there's one thing I've never been able to forget. When I first started backing up before I accelerated to escape, I glanced briefly at the sedan blocking the road, and for a second, I saw someone sitting in the driver's seat watching my car through the dark windshield. The person didn't start the vehicle, didn't get out, didn't make any movement. They simply sat there waiting while the flashlights approached from both sides of the road. Story 6. My name is Daniel. I'm 44 years old and work as a veterinarian specializing in large animals in eastern South Dakota. Most of my work involves visiting farms spread across rural areas, many of them quite isolated. Because of that, it's not uncommon to receive calls late at night asking for help with injured horses, cows having difficulty during labor, or other emergencies that can't wait until the next day. This happened in late summer of 2022. I was at home finishing some reports when I received a call shortly after 9 o'clock at night. The man on the other end of the line sounded nervous and spoke quickly. He said he had a severely injured animal on a remote property and needed urgent help. The signal was poor, and his voice cut out occasionally because of the storm moving through the region that night. Even so, I managed to write down some coordinates that were sent to me by text message shortly after the call ended. I didn't think anything was particularly strange at the time. Similar situations happen frequently in my line of work. The rain was already falling heavily when I left in my field service truck equipped for mobile veterinary calls. Lightning constantly flashed on the horizon, and the wind swayed the crops along the roads. The drive took about an hour. As I moved farther away from populated areas, traffic disappeared completely. At times, I went more than 15 minutes without seeing another vehicle. The GPS continued indicating that I was heading in the correct direction, although the roads became increasingly smaller and less traveled. When I finally approached the coordinates sent by the supposed property owner, I began to find the situation strange. I expected to find a farm, a house, or at least some agricultural buildings. Instead, I saw only a large open field stretching into the darkness. The only thing illuminated was an old barn in the distance. The structure was partially lit by floodlights connected to a portable generator running beside the building. The generator's engine produced a constant noise that could be heard even through the rain. There was no visible house, no corral, no silo, no sign of animals, just that solitary barn standing in the middle of the plains beneath the storm. I parked my truck near the barn and remained inside for a few moments, observing the area through the windshield. Rain continuously struck the glass while the wipers worked non-stop. The more I studied the area, the stranger it seemed. Farms normally show clear signs of activity. There are parked vehicles, well-maintained fences, agricultural equipment, or at least some residents nearby. There was none of that. The barn appeared old and relatively poorly maintained. Some of the exterior boards were warped and parts of the roof showed obvious signs of wear. Even so, the generator was functioning perfectly, powering 2 floodlights that illuminated the main entrance. I picked up my phone and tried calling back the number that had requested the emergency visit. The call didn't go through. I tried again and received only an automated message stating that the number was unavailable. That increased my uneasiness. I stepped out of the truck and walked toward the entrance of the barn, calling out for the owner. My voice was almost completely drowned out by the combined sound of rain, wind, and the generator. No one responded. I heard no animals. I heard no people, only the constant noise of the storm surrounding the structure. It was when I began walking around the building looking for any sign of activity that I noticed something on the ground. There were fresh tire tracks everywhere, not just 1 or 2 trails. Numerous tracks crossed through the mud around the barn in different directions. Some appeared very recent because their edges remained clearly defined despite the rain. The impression was that several vehicles had been there not long before my arrival. While examining the tracks with my flashlight, I heard something coming from inside the barn. Voices, very muffled voices. At first, I thought I had finally found the people I was looking for. But the more I listened, the stranger it seemed. The voices didn't sound like people having a normal conversation. They sounded like rapid whispers or fragments of conversation interrupted by the sound of the rain and the generator engine. I couldn't distinguish specific words. I only knew that more than one person was speaking inside. I called out again, announcing that I was the veterinarian who had been requested. The sound stopped immediately. It didn't gradually fade away. It didn't move farther away. It simply stopped. The sudden silence was so strange that I stood still for several seconds, trying to decide whether I had actually heard something or whether the storm had distorted my perception. I remained near the side of the barn for a while, waiting to hear the voices again. Nothing happened. The only sounds were the rain hitting the metal roof and the generator running a few yards away. I was beginning to seriously consider leaving. Even if someone truly was inside the structure, the situation made no sense. No animal had been presented. No owner had appeared, and the phone number used to contact me was no longer reachable. Still, I decided to quickly check the interior before leaving. I walked to one of the large sliding barn doors and shined my flashlight through the opening. The interior appeared almost empty. There were some old tools, weathered hay bales, and rusted pieces of agricultural equipment scattered across the floor. The place smelled of damp wood and old oil. There were no animals inside. No people were visible. While observing the interior, I once again had the feeling that someone had just moved out of my line of sight. I didn't directly see movement, but it was that difficult to explain sensation that you aren't alone even when you can't see anyone. That was when I decided to return to my truck and end the visit. I took out my phone once more to try contacting the emergency number while walking toward the vehicle. That's when something happened that still makes me uncomfortable whenever I think about it. Without any warning, the sound of the generator disappeared. It wasn't a gradual failure. The engine simply shut off. At the exact same moment, the floodlights went dark. All the lighting around the barn vanished at once. The darkness was absolute. The only remaining light came from occasional lightning flashes in the distance and the small flashlight I carried. My heart immediately began racing. Instinctively, I pointed the flashlight toward the generator. It was completely silent. The problem was that only seconds earlier, it had been running normally. Someone would have had to approach it to shut it down, and I hadn't seen anyone pass by me. The feeling of vulnerability at that moment was overwhelming. That isolated barn had become a dark silhouette in the middle of miles of open field, and I had no idea who else might be there with me. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and started walking quickly toward the truck. The rain seemed even heavier now that the floodlights were gone. Each gust of wind sent water sideways into my face, making it difficult to see more than a few yards ahead. As I moved away from the barn, I heard a noise behind me. It sounded like a heavy door closing. The sound echoed clearly because of the empty structure. I stopped briefly and looked back. The barn remained completely dark. My flashlight illuminated only small portions of the exterior, but I couldn't see any movement. Then another sound appeared. This time it was footsteps. Not running footsteps, but quick steps moving through wet mud. They were coming from somewhere near the side of the building. My instincts immediately told me not to stay there trying to figure out who it was. I continued walking toward the truck without looking back again. When I reached the driver's door, my hands were shaking so badly that it took 2 attempts to fit the key properly. I got inside, locked everything, and started the engine as quickly as possible. Only after turning on the headlights did I feel a small sense of relief. At least now I could see part of the property again, but the headlights ended up revealing something that unsettled me even more. When the beams illuminated the area around the barn, I could clearly see that several vehicles were hidden behind the structure. Not just 1 or 2, at least 4 or 5. Some appeared to be pickup trucks. Others were dark-colored SUVs. None of them had been visible when I arrived because they were parked on the opposite side of the building. That discovery answered one question but created several more. The tire tracks made sense now. The muffled voices did too. What I couldn't understand was why no one had come out to speak with me. I remained watching through the windshield for a few seconds. Then I saw something move near one of the vehicles. A person quickly appeared between 2 vehicles and disappeared again. Shortly afterward, another silhouette appeared farther away. I couldn't make out faces or clothing because of the rain and distance. But there were people there, and they seemed to be watching my truck. At that point, I abandoned any intention of figuring out what was happening at that place. I shifted into gear and started leaving the property as quickly as the road conditions allowed. I drove for several minutes without looking back any more than necessary. The dirt road was extremely slippery because of the storm, and I needed to focus completely on staying on the road. Even so, I constantly checked the mirrors. For the first several miles, I saw no headlights following me. That should have reassured me, but it didn't. My mind kept trying to understand why someone would create a fake veterinary emergency to lure a person to such an isolated location. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. After approximately 20 minutes of driving, I finally reached a state highway where my phone signal returned. I immediately pulled onto a shoulder illuminated by a utility light and called the county sheriff's office. I reported everything that had happened, including the original phone call, the barn, the voices, the hidden vehicles, and the generator suddenly shutting down. The dispatcher took the situation seriously and asked me to send the approximate coordinates that were still recorded in my truck's GPS. I did so before continuing my trip. That night I didn't drive straight home. I stopped in a nearby town, rented a motel room, and stayed awake for hours mentally reviewing everything I had seen. 2 days later, I received a follow-up call from a deputy who had participated in the investigation. According to him, the team found the barn exactly where I had described. The building was abandoned and there was no generator on the property when they arrived. They also found no vehicles parked near the structure. The detail that caught my attention most was another piece of information. The phone number that had requested the emergency visit wasn't registered in any records provided by the telephone company. Basically, they were unable to identify who had made the call. To this day, I don't know what the purpose was behind luring someone to that barn during a stormy night. Maybe there was a simple explanation. Maybe those people were using the structure for some activity they didn't want interrupted by strangers. But there is one specific memory that continues to bother me. When my headlights illuminated the vehicles hidden behind the barn, I saw one of the people standing beside a pickup truck watching me leave. They didn't try to follow me. They didn't try to stop me. They simply stood there watching. And the more I think about it, the more convinced I am that shutting off the generator wasn't an accident or a coincidence. Someone waited for the exact moment I decided to leave to turn off the property's only source of light and make sure I understood that I should never have been there that night.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.